So we prioritize by site. We have some high biodiversity sites on Long Island that we work with. This is one of our sites that we like to work with here. We also prioritize by invasive species. We have priority conservation areas, including the 12 ISPZs, we call them, invasive species prevention zones. These are relatively large areas for Long Island, I think 500 acres and up, that are mostly free of invasive species, except around the borders and some localized spots inside. So these areas contain a lot of Long Island's biodiversity, not all of it, but they're biodiversity hotspots. These are grouped into 6 management complexes so that they're linked ecologically rather than just through property ownership boundaries. And then we have natural heritage sites like this site, like Hempstead Plains and Sayville grassland, that we work with partners to help manage invasive species, help plant invasive species, and help them manage as we can. Priority water bodies are important for us. LIISMA and our partners, we ranked more than 700 water bodies on Long Island, 700 ponds and streams. And we prioritized, again, based on their value for biodiversity and also for recreation and other resource values. So we have a list of our top, say we can make 25 or 30 or 50, our top water bodies. Many of those tend to be coastal plain ponds, which are very rich in biodiversity on Long Island and threatened by invasive species and several other threats. So we work with priority water bodies quite often. Okay, so those are the sites. We prioritize by site, and then we prioritize by species. And how we do that, we use the best available science and expert opinion to categorize invasive species based on their ecological impact, their distribution, their abundance, and the feasibility of management. And New York State has a tier list, we call it, which is available on the internet when the internet works. So you can see the priority species. There's tiers 1 is the highest priority down to tier 4, which is a lower priority. And then we have M, category M, for monitoring some invasive species that we're just keeping an eye on for now. Early detection and rapid response is important. We focus on species that are of the highest impact. Those would be tier 1 and 2. And of the lowest abundance, they're still manageable, still controllable, limited in distribution, and still feasibly managed. So that's how we prioritize our work. And you'll hear more about that today, beginning with Abby Marino, who will talk about our priority conservation areas and the work, give you an update on the work that we've been doing with those.
Thanks, Bill, for the introduction on prioritization. So we'll start a little bit with that water body prioritization that he mentioned. We continued our system surveying priority water bodies this year, and for early detection of aquatic invasive species. So we're kind of starting with some of the highest quality areas that if we can catch those infestations first, before they become very abundant, then we're at the right end of the curve. We're minimizing the effort required, cost required, and getting that early detection in these priority areas. So with that, we surveyed 4 water bodies at Connecticut State Park, which included managing a previously known infestation of water chestnut, Crappington, and also finding 1 new water chestnut individual in a water body that was just downstream of where that first one was. So in both cases, early detection and work. We also visited Fresh Pond in Hither Hills State Park to document the extent of the Phragmites there. We found no other aquatic invasive species there, although there was a few stands of Phragmites. And lastly, we surveyed the Permins River to see the extent of water pepper. We're not sure if the species there is a non-native species or a native species. It's really hard to identify Persicaria, but we will be visiting there actually later in the season to look at the seed difference. And the managers there note that it really grows thickly, densely in blocking some of the stream channels. So they just want to know what the species is, and we were helping them document it. We also continued our projects in proactive Phragmites management. While Phragmites is very abundant in the whole region, because we're not going to manage it in all the areas that it is, we do care about it when it's in these sensitive environments. And there's just a little bit of it that we can prevent it from taking over the whole water body. So with that, we're working at Bellows Pond, where we did staging of Phragmites on the shoreline and also measured biodiversity and the other plants in the area with the hula hoop. And just last week, we were at Long Pond with partners to manage the Phragmites that's growing in the center of the pond on a floating water lily mat. Interesting environment. And so those have both been successful. We've seen decreases and definitely decreases in fitness of the Phragmites from this repeated cutting and staging development. And lastly, we did some on-land projects in our invasive species prevention zones, managing pale swallowwort in Otis Pike State Forest. I had 2 populations there. There aren't that many populations of swallowwort in the pine barrens, so these were a priority for us to prevent their further seed spread. And also, we just invaded a Sarnoff preserve to monitor for invasive species there. Great place. And next, Melody will tell us more about the early detection and rapid response projects.
Thanks, Abby, for that introduction. My name's Melody. I'm our early detection and rapid response manager. All right. So first, LIISMA revisited the site of Arundo donax, or a giant reed, reported at Hammond's Pond County Park in Merritt, following a previous visit by LIISMA staff after finding research-grade observations of the plant on iNaturalist. 5 large stands of the giant reed seem to be intentionally planted adjacent to the northeast portion of the pond. The giant reed appears to be slowly increasing in size, with rhizomatous shoots creeping in from the sides. Giant reed is a high-impact Tier 2 species prioritized for eradication in LIISMA. LIISMA is working to get in contact with Nassau County Parks to work on a plan for replacing this population with a native grass species. Next, we worked at the Muttontown Preserve. LIISMA delineated a single shrub of fuzzy Deutzia, or Deutzia scabra, at the Muttontown Preserve in Muttontown, New York. Deutzia is a Tier 3 species listed for containment. The staff at Nassau County Soil and Water Conservation District manages the site and removes the shrub, and will continue to monitor the site for reemergence of the species. Next, we have Dioscorea polysgacha, or invasive yam. The LIISMA team revisited Alley Pond Park in Queens, New York, to further investigate iNaturalist reports of Dioscorea within the park. It was confirmed that the observations were in fact invasive yam due to the bulbils present, clockwise twining of tendrils, and low cordate leaves with parallel veins. Populations were detected on the northeast and northwest portions of the park. The team did not locate a southern population, though iNaturalist reports indicate that one may exist. LIISMA is working with New York City Parks to determine a management strategy for this Tier 2 species. LIISMA found reports of wild teasel on iNaturalist within Bethany State Park surrounding the restoration meadow. Wild teasel is a Tier 3 species within the LIISMA region, meaning it's a species of known high impact and medium abundance in the region that have a goal for containment. Using IMAP Mobile Advanced on ArcGIS field maps, LIISMA recorded 5 points where small stands of wild teasel were found, with 2 to 16 plants at each point. A combined count of 48 individuals were documented within the meadow border at Bethpage, growing among the native species. LIISMA coordinated with the horticultural maintenance staff of Victor Azaretto and Alexa Roldos at Bethpage State Park to have the species removed, and the staff removed them promptly and will continue to monitor for reemergence of the species. LIISMA's been hard at work controlling Ludwigia on our own and alongside our partners. LIISMA staff joined New York City Parks to remove 12 bags of Ludwigia on their first volunteer day, and there were 2 more volunteer days after that. LIISMA has had an ongoing project at Artist Lake, removing 2 populations from the shoreline. And unfortunately, we found 2 more small populations, so we do have our work cut out for us. However, good news is that much of the native Ludwigia is returning to the shoreline in place of what we've pulled. We will be managing the site for years to come until all the Ludwigia is eradicated from Artist Lake. In other news, as part of an EDRR survey, LIISMA found Ludwigia emerging at Alley Pond Park in Queens and is working with New York City Parks on a possible management plan for next year. We have spotted lanternfly. LIISMA has been working with partners across Long Island to distribute spotted lanternfly traps. This year, we have 10 traps deployed from Nassau County to Montauk. We're working with the town of Hempstead, the town of Huntington, the Pine Barrens Commission, North Shore Land Alliance, and Third House Nature Center. We're collecting bi-weekly data on trap observations to relay back to New York State agriculture and markets. This helps them to understand which locations across Long Island are most heavily impacted, so the next steps for management can be taken. Then our plans for the field season include our Fraxon management in Montauk and the East End to oversee town risk management with the town of Brookhaven, a survey for yellow loosestrife at South Haven County Park, and kudzu management at up to 10 sites across the island as part of our partnership with the DEC Kudzu Control Team. Now I'm going to hand the mic over to Cassidy to talk a little bit about education and outreach.
Thanks, Melody. All right, so while we were very busy over the summer with our field projects, we've also been busy engaging with our partners, as many of you know, and outreaching with the public. So starting in June, we had New York Invasive Species Awareness Week. Lots of our partners had wonderful events. The North Shore Land Alliance hosted a knotweed removal at the Redcoat Preserve, or Roosevelt Preserve rather, and you can see some photos of them hard at work. And in the bottom right, we have some garbage bags full of water chestnut. The DEC hosted several water chestnut removal events and removed thousands of pounds of water chestnut. That was great. And LIISMA also hosted a virtual webinar on aquatic invasive species management. In June, we also hosted a volunteer training for the North Shore Land Alliance. You can see photos here of Abby and I teaching some volunteers identification. We started with an indoor workshop component where we went over ID factors and how to report invasive species, and then got out in the field and walked around the Humes Preserve to practice those skills and ID in person. As part of NISOP, we also hosted a poster contest. The theme this year was invasive species prevention. These are just some of the wonderful poster submissions we received. These are our favorites. You can see some on Asian Park, mute swan, water hyacinth, some really artistic and insightful posters that we received. So congrats to all those winners. Moving into July, we hosted a training for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service interns for the summer. We walked around the Sable grassland and showed the volunteers how to use a dichotomous key and field guides to identify invasive plants and native plants alike, and enjoyed exploring this unique ecosystem with them. Moving into July, Abby and Bill presented at the Relief Conference on invasive trees in urban environments. There they spoke with municipality leaders and community members on those invasive trees. Also not pictured here, in July, we hosted a virtual presentation for the town of Southampton on general invasive species management and identification, and also showcasing the biodiversity of their unique ecosystems in Southampton. Lastly, in August, we hosted a presentation at the Third House Nature Center out in Montauk. This is a lovely place to visit. We also gave an indoor presentation to members attending, similarly on invasive species identification, a little bit on reporting as well, and then got out in the field and explored and ID'd our invasives together. So to talk about a few of the upcoming events we have. September 24th to 26th is the Invasive Species Expo. This takes place in Saratoga Spa State Park. It's upcoming, and you can register. There's still time left at NISRI.org. It's quite a hike, but if you're interested, you're more than welcome to join. You can ask us more about that after if you'd like. All right. We'd like to announce our upcoming Resilient Long Island Symposium. This will most likely be on March 8th and 9th, 2024. We will send out an official save the date soon with the location to find. And you can find more info about this at LIISMA.org/LIISMA-news. But we currently have an open call for abstracts right now. So if you work in this field, as many of you do, with invasive species, native plants, restoration work, anything like that, you're more than welcome to submit a abstract if you'd like to give a presentation, whether an oral presentation or a poster presentation. Those are due by September 26th, I believe. That's on our website to double check. Yeah. And lastly, we also have an open grant program, the 2023 Invasive Species Grant Program. This is funded by the DEC, and there are several project categories open. If you have an idea for a project you've been wanting to implement, these are some of the categories that you may be able to get funding for. EDRR, control of terrestrial and aquatic invasives, aquatic invasive species watercraft spread prevention, lake management planning and implementation, invasive species education and outreach, invasive species research. And if you scan that code at the bottom, you can download the full application and info about the grant. Feel free to talk with us more if you have some ideas you'd like to grant. We may have the opportunity to do so later as well. All right, so now moving on to our partner spotlight, I'd like to introduce Rob Longiaru. He's the Habitat Director for the Friends of the Hempstead Plains, focusing on invasive species removal and grassland restoration. He also works as a conservation biologist with the Town of Hempstead's Department of Conservation and Waterways, focused on shorebird management and habitat restoration. Rob is also the Vice President of the Long Island Native Plant Initiative and is currently helping administer the LIISMA Prism. All right, please welcome Rob Longiaru.
I have no slides. I provided nothing. I didn't even provide internet for this meeting, so I do apologize. And anyone who's not here in person, but for the folks who are here in person, thank you very much for coming out. I already heard from some of you that this is your first time here, so welcome. This is something that I've been trying to do since I started here 3 years ago, is to get more people in the door and recognizing this awesome ecological, but also cultural gem in Nassau County and the South Shore of Long Island. Many of us grew up here on Long Island, and I always try to bring people in and separate the plant life from the history behind the Hempstead Plains. Not only the geology of it, but how this land was used for centuries, well before we were here. So I just want to give a quick introduction into the plains and what we do here. We're going to do a little walk and talk later, so we can get all of our questions and ideas out of our system then. We have some great partners here, such as LIISMA. But Steve Young is in the house today, who is an integral part to our management practices here, as him and the Natural Heritage Foundation were able to put together a management plan for this site several years ago. And we're still using that today to prioritize our work, starting from high priority areas down to the lower areas. The unique thing that we're going to look at today when we take our walk is that we did a prescribed burn here for the first time in over 30 years. We burned about 5 acres of this 17-acre parcel, and now is the perfect time to see those results. We have a lot of great stuff in bloom. The purpose behind our burns, since we haven't done it in so long, was to just flat out get fire on the plains. We didn't really prioritize a specific location yet. We were just so invested in getting the other stuff out of the way. So there's a lot that goes into getting a prescribed fire done. We use the company Sustainable Solutions out of West Virginia, who also do work in Suffolk County out in the Pine Barren. So they were experienced on Long Island. Actually, their CEO grew up on Long Island, or his family did. So he had a connection here, which is kind of like a passion project for his company, that they would come out to Long Island and do that work. So they were able to burn 5 acres, and we kind of had a smattering of different habitats, starting with our endangered species plot, which is about a 1 acre plot that houses our globally rare Agellinus acuta, Sandplain Gerardia, which is currently in bloom. So when we take a walk later, we'll actually hopefully get to see some of those flowers in bloom. It's just a beautiful little delicate plant, and that was one of the reasons we wanted to burn that stock, because we knew that would have an impact right away. We've seen it already. That area looks fantastic. But other reasons for burning is to get rid of leaf litter and fuels that are on the ground. We've really just been mowing and hand pulling for the last 30 years, so you can imagine the amount of fuel that's on the ground. In addition to that, we have a lot of woody intrusion at this parcel. mostly due to lack of fire over the years. So that's probably our biggest issue right now is combating woody intrusion. So that did thin out some of it. We burned a little late. We didn't burn until about April 19th we burned. And if any of you remember, we had a super hot week the week before in early April. It was almost close to 90 degrees. Everything, it went from winter to spring in 3 days. So everything started to green up. And that was the same week that the fire people said, hey, we're coming out. And I sent them a whole bunch of pictures on like a Tuesday of that week. By the time they got here Monday, everything was greened up and they were like, what the heck? These aren't the same pictures. And that's how fast things happen. So timing was definitely an issue, but we did get it done and we yielded, some really great results in certain spots. So our goal in the future is to burn annually. We want to get into a burn management plan where we burn a small parcel, 10 acres per year, and switch that around based on the success. In the interim years, we'll then do hand removals and mowing as needed to combat some of those species that are coming back quickly. I'd say our biggest woody intrusion issue right now are the sumac species. While they're not an invasive species, it's certainly not a grassland species and takes over rather quickly. So we're definitely losing grassland currently to sumac species, especially you'll notice when we get into the burn area, the very start of the burn area is all sumac and they were taller than all of us. Those didn't really burn well. But a lot of the small saplings really fried very well, which gave us an opportunity to now go in there and hand cut some of them, maybe on the side, whatever. There's a lot of different, as we all know, there's a lot of different methods to take care of different problems. Each site is unique, and for us, each sub-site within our site is very unique. I certainly don't want to be laying herbicides down around endangered species plot, but in a poverty area like right in front of the building, which has been disturbed for decades, that's a little different. Beyond that, we have an education program director here who's per diem at this point, and we bring in classes of all ages, K through 12, to give them an outdoor lab experience. He worked for BOCES for many years. He's faculty at Nassau Community College, along with many other endeavors, and he actually built a curriculum K through 12 to meet New York State science standards, which allows us to bring a whole new group of students in, and we try to expand those programs for the fall and the spring because that's a great revenue producer for us here at the Plains. So we're trying to build up those programs, and obviously hosting an event like this is a great opportunity to say, if you know people who are interested, especially in Nassau County, school groups, what have you, and we're open for that. The way we try to do it is if it's a very small, passive little group, like 5 people, we usually don't charge if it's during our open hours. If it's a flexible time where I got to make time for it, I'll usually ask for a small donation per person. But if it's a school group or legitimate group that are getting the full program from our program director, there are fees to that help us stay afloat. So there's a lot of opportunity for there. If you have people within your network who are looking for something in Nassau County, since COVID, we really had to completely restart the way we did things. So we're getting back to that now, and I felt like utilizing this space more, not just for regular school groups, but for anyone, art classes, what have you. It's a great little space, and then gives me an opportunity to say, hey, come look at this. This is a very unique place. And that's what I like to tie this to. Most people that come here, it's their first time, maybe it's their only time, and they don't realize why this is protected. Beyond the listed species, which really gives us that extra oomph to protect this place. Historically, this place was protected by faculty and activists from the college. So Betsy Galato, who's the founder of this organization, the Friends of Hempstead Plains, has been in the biology department since the late 60s at Nassau Community. She's still teaching as an adjunct professor. She's still heavily involved in Hempstead Plains. And she's the reason I'm here, the reason the Friends Group exists, and the reason most people know about this place is because of her and her work for all these years. So if you look up on the internet, anything on the Hempstead Plains, it's usually Betsy Galato's face or her voice talking about how wonderful this place is. So I guess I'm second fiddle at this point, trying to push the mission and what we're trying to do here, and at least just get people here to experience this really awesome cultural and ecological gem. I look forward to walking around with everyone and answering questions, and we can talk more about invasive species all day, but there's some great folks here that are going to talk about some better stuff that I have. So I'll leave it like that for now, and we can talk all we want later. So thank you all for coming, and if you have any questions directly, just come find me. I have a video of the burn that I can't show because I don't have internet, but if that happens, I'd be happy to show that. That's weird to prepare us to going out could you give us a little bit of history, because I know the Hempstead Plains is the largest grass prairie east of the Ohio River, as I understand it. But what makes the ecology or the soil structure here particular that a grassland, could survive in between oak forests and also succession, like with the sumacs coming in? Why didn't that happen at an earlier time?
Sure. Well, first for soils and why we have the habitat we have, if you look at the map to everyone's right here, you can see the dark red, the glacial moraine of Long Island. Most of us are aware of how Long Island was formed. We are a coastal outwash plain, super unique habitat type that's really found nowhere else, but in an island like us that is formed in a very unique way. So that has given us a very unique type of habitat where it's flat and cruddy soils, but at the same time, we have a very unique maritime influence. So that changes the genetics of these plants and how they've survived for years, which makes Hempstead Plains plants even more unique than the little blue stem you find out in the Great Plains. So that ties into LIIMPI, and what those folks are doing is trying to, strengthen that genetic diversity across Long Island, because we know it's an issue. Diversity across Long Island, whether it's plants or animals, are a massive issue due to invasive species and lack of management in many places. But in terms of succession and why it's not all a woodlands, there was fire naturally or also sort of on purpose for many years. European settlers, Native Americans used this land for grazing and hunting and agriculture for centuries. So there was intentional burning of the land to create hunting grounds, to create agricultural space. So also lightning, as we know, is a natural cause of fires, and that keeps some of those things down. In my opinion, a lot of the woody intrusion is usually non-native species, and they're coming because we're not in a coast system. We are surrounded by suburbia, urban environments, people putting in gardens that probably shouldn't be there, kind of untended land on the side, and we're left with the rest. There's a great open area for these plants to find their niche, and without us doing management at this point, this will all become a pretty overrun forest at some point, which across the street, Purcell Preserve is still part of the Hempstead Plains. It's a 26-acre parcel owned by Nassau County. And we do some management there. There's some really nice parcels of grassland, but there's also some pretty significant woodland that's well beyond management at this point. And even beyond that, there's other parcels that are also considered Hempstead Plains, and we have very little management over there because we have enough to handle here that it is very difficult. Burning is the most effective, not only cost effective, but time effective way to handle this. We could burn a big spot. We burned 5 acres in 5 hours. We could have burned the whole place in a day and a half. So, I mean, it's really a unique opportunity for us to see how we could speed up our restoration, because we've really set ourselves back for 30 years by not having fire out there. So I think we've really accommodated all of the stakeholders involved in our fire, local fire, EMS, the local governments and colleges. They got to see it, they got to experience it, they got to say, hey, this was safe, this was a great operation, we'd love to see you do it again. And that was a lot of our trials for this. We were very worried about the other stuff. This was the easy part. Get the guys who know what they're doing, and we know the results will be strong, but what is everyone else? The smoke on the highway, all those little pieces gave us the stress for many, many months, actually kicked the can for an extra year because the board got a little spooked at one time. And we regathered and we figured out a way, and the price doubled through COVID. So we ended up not burning as much as we would have liked with the money we had, but we were able to get fire on the plains, and we're going to see those benefits today and show the reason why we need to burn more, and we'll burn. So without further ado,
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
Bethany Bradley is a professor of biogeography and invasion ecology in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Her research has a strong focus on terrestrial plant invasion with the goal of understanding how invasive plant distributions, abundance, and impact vary spatially. Bethany also leads the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change, or WISP, Management Network, or ISCC, Management Network, which addresses the question of how we can better manage for upcoming biological invasions in light of climate change. Please welcome Bethany Bradley.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Sorry for all the technical difficulties you guys we're all collectively going through right now. The folks on Zoom can later attest that I am an actual person and not just a voice on the phone. I'm going to do my best to say next slide when I'm advancing slides so that you guys can keep up with me and I can more or less see what the screen looks like. So I think we're going to make it work. So folks on Zoom will have an easy time, easier time, I think. So thanks so much for having me. I sit in Western Massachusetts at UMass Amherst. And what I'm going to talk about today is very much work in collaboration with a bunch of people who volunteer for the leadership team of the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change, or Risk Management Network. If you haven't heard of us and are interested in invasive species and climate change, I'd really encourage you to check out our website and our work. I'm going to feature a lot of it today, and I'll put our website on the slide at the end. And if you're interested in invasive species and climate change work, and specifically informing a bunch of scientists on how we could do better to help you in your work on invasive species and climate change, we are always interested in accepting new participants, new members to the leadership team, which is essentially a community of practice and working group. So thanks so much again for having me talk today. So that you know my biases, I am a plant invasion ecologist, so it's going to be more planty than you might be used to. All right, next slide. So just to start, this is probably obvious to everybody, but to have some data, because I come from the science side, we know that invasive species, no matter what the taxa, are harmful to ecosystems. This is from a meta-analysis from a few years ago, looking at what happens as you increase invader abundance. And a meta-analysis is basically a study of multiple studies. So this is the average response when you combine several hundred different studies looking at time series, looking at change in abundance over space. Then on average, as you go from low invader abundance to high invader abundance, you're losing about 25% of native diversity. And that slope is actually quite a bit steeper when you're talking about the introduction of herbivores on impacting plants, and when you're talking about the introduction of higher trophic levels, basically affecting consuming lower trophic levels. You probably don't need the science, these kind of graphs, to convince you that invasive species harm ecosystems, right? We can look at lots of different pictures. This is the picture from the southeast of Kudzu that, oh, sorry, next slide. That the picture in the image, basically in the lower right corner, is a house, I believe, or was once a house. So these types of images that we see from all over the world, are pretty convincing that we don't actually need the science to tell us that invasive species harm ecosystems. Next slide. And so now I'm telling you that on top of this, you have to think about climate change as well as just those invasive species. Next slide. So there is a little bit of good news when we're talking about the combination of invasive species and climate change. And that is this graph on the right is another meta-analysis. The paper title is at the top of this. Meta-analysis of several hundred experimental studies. The gray bar on here, so the one on the left that says GEC at the bottom, that is the combined effect of global environmental change. So global environmental changes in this case were warming, drought, and nitrogen deposition. So that's their effect alone on ecosystem, various different things that we might consider to be harmful to ecosystems. So a 0 basically means no difference having that change or not on ecosystems. Below 0 means there's a negative effect on ecosystems. But you'll notice one thing, that global environmental change by itself actually overlaps 0, which means even though we've got this sort of suggestion of a negative effect from these global environmental changes, warming, drought, nitrogen deposition, it's actually not significantly different from zero. What is significantly different are invasions. So that's the middle bar, the INV one. So invasions have a significantly negative effect on native ecosystems and native species. The good news, or a little bit of silver lining here, is that if you combine invasions and global environmental change, there is, a lot of concern that those two stressors combined could be way worse for ecosystems. And in fact, what we find in this meta-analysis is that they're about the same as invasions on their own. So addressing invasions, the bottom line here is that addressing invasions goes a long way to mitigating ecological impact and building more resilient communities. Next slide, please. Another sort of source of optimism, maybe, or maybe just like a little less pessimism, is that this is sort of our status quo. I think pretty much everybody on the management side tends to be quite familiar with the invasion curve, right? If we start on the left side, we get way more bang for our buck. If we're managing things that are already widespread, it's extremely costly and not very effective at actually successfully reducing the impacts of those invasions. Right now, we are managing a lot of species that are widespread. The source of optimism is on the next slide, which is that when we add climate change to this equation, we're way back at the prevention stage. We're talking about species that have not yet arrived, that are emerging into the areas, often ones that we can actually identify. So we can say, like, okay, here's the set of species that we should be concerned about. And that means that we have that opportunity to actually have some real wins if we can get our policy, if we can get our management aligned to prevent those new invasions from coming. Next slide. All right, so this is a long list of all of the things that I'm going to talk about today. It's going to be kind of a breeze through of various different topics. Next slide. But the good news is that you can read about this because all of this is in a paper that came out earlier this year. I don't know if I sent this to Cassidy. I'm totally happy to do that so that you have access to it if you want to refer back to any of the points that we talk about today about becoming more climate smart in our invasive species policy and management. Next slide. All right, so let's start with this first point, which is learning about invasive species and climate change. So essentially, knowledge is power. The more you learn, the more you can think about how what you know integrates with the work that you're doing. Next slide, please. So through the Northeast Risk Network, we've done a lot of synthesis research, and we've created a lot of resources that kind of bring together the state of the science about invasive species and climate change. So since you're in the Northeast, this is a really nice place to go if you're interested in learning more about invasive species and climate change. We have quite a series of what we call management challenges. That's the sort of snapshot on the right of these, kind of walkthroughs of what the state of the science is. This one on the right is actually an example of a synthesis that we put together based on knowledge from managers. So that was actually created after a LIISMA workshop in 2019. So a lot of these are sort of recommendations of what people are already doing in terms of managing invasive species in the context of climate change. And then the picture on the left is from our last symposium. So you can, if you're interested in more of this, you can join our listserv and get more information. But we also have an annual online symposium that's typically in sort of February, March time period, date not set yet, for 2024. Next slide, please. But just to give you a real quick sort of overview so that you've got some more information about how invasive species and climate change interact. And this picture is from another management challenge that we put together. So if you want to refer back to this, you can find it open. All of these are open source on our website. I'm going to start from the cloudy storms in the upper left and kind of go around in a circle. So first way that climate change can affect invasive species is by increasing the number, both the magnitude and the number of extreme events. Lots of rain this summer, lots of heat this summer. In past summers, we've had, last summer we had a big drought. Those are examples of extreme events that can really knock back native communities. And anytime we have that type of large scale disturbance, you end up with opportunities for invasive species to emerge. So being prepared for more climate extremes, that includes not just those sort of like extreme rainfall, drought, and heavy rainfall events, but also includes more extreme hurricanes. I was just looking at the news of Hurricane Lee headed our way towards the end of next week. The one in the middle top is has to do with phenology, which is the sort of growing seasons of species. That as climate is warming, we have invasive species emerging earlier and hanging around longer because growing seasons are extended. That means not only do they have, if we're talking about defoliating insects, do they have more time to keep munching on leaves, but they also have opportunities to have multiple growing cycles, which can, sort of amplify the impact. So just down from there, invasive species shifting their ranges into new ecosystems with warming. This is one that that a lot of people have heard of, and a lot of people are really concerned about. That we've got this whole set of invasive species we're dealing with today. As climate warms, the species that our neighbors to the south are dealing with are headed our way. Another big thing is the sort of unknowns that are coming our way. So invasive species can be introduced by new pathways as sea ice melts. So the historic Northwest Passage is actually opening up as we have increasing open water in the Arctic, especially, certainly in the Arctic summers these days, there's a lot more open water up there. Right now, the biggest shipping pathways, if we're talking about coming from, let's say, temperate forested ecosystems of East Asia to North America, those typically go through ports like LA or ports on the West Coast, and then get put on trains or trucks and shipped across to New York. But with sea ice melt, you have these opportunities for shipping that comes direct from temperate East Asia to ports of New York, and that means that any wood-boring beetles, for example, or other critters that are hanging out on wood pellets or just in the goods themselves have a higher likelihood of being introduced directly into Northeast temperate forests. So bigger unknowns associated with that of what's coming next. That's especially concerning for insect pests and pathogens. The bottom two have to do with plants specifically. So in the lower right, invasives are becoming more competitive with warming and higher atmospheric CO2. Warming especially gives them a longer growing season. So plants too get an advantage by, got a lot of invasive plants in the Northeast that are some of the sort of first out of the gates in the spring. Having an earlier spring means that they have an even bigger advantage in terms of growing early. And then atmospheric CO2, which is the main driver of human-caused climate change, that is also a fertilizer for plants, right? So if we add a whole bunch of fertilizer to lots of different plants, because invasive plants tend to have these weedy, fast growth traits, they have an extra advantage associated with this essentially fertilizer of increased atmospheric CO2, even more than most of our native plants. And then that last one is the little spray can. So herbicides are less effective with higher atmospheric CO2. The reason behind this is because as you increase the fertilization associated with higher atmospheric CO2, what happens is that plants tend to put more of their biomass below ground. And so when you're spraying the leafy parts of that plant, they've got more resources below ground to recover from herbicide treatment. So that may mean that we need either higher dosages of herbicides or more application treatments to actually kill or treat invasive plants. That was a whirlwind. Let's go on to the next slide. All of those examples are ones to kind of keep in the back of your head or learn more about. Sharing information across borders becomes a really important piece, area to work on when we're talking about invasive species and climate change. I know in talking to several states in the Northeast that there are lots of really good networks within state. So within the prisms, across the prisms, you guys have a lot of really great communication going on. What I would say is lean into talking to folks from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and further south, make more of those connections there, because the stuff that they're dealing with is headed your way pretty quickly. And an example is in the next slide. So this is an image from a study from now a handful of years ago that's looking at hotspots for invasive plants in the lower 48 states by mid-century. So we're getting closer to 2050. So the red areas on here are areas where you have, upwards of 100 new invasive plants likely to arrive or to become suitable, I should say. So the habitat and the climate becomes suitable for those species by mid-century. So it's a lot of new species. If we're, where I am in Western Massachusetts, just about all of New York is in red, as are a bunch of other New England states. So a lot of range shifting species coming our way. Next slide, please. The good news is that our neighbors to the south know about those species. They know what's coming, not both the identity of the species that they're already dealing with, and management methods for treating those species. So this is a graph, two different graphs actually from surveys that were conducted in 2018. And on the first one, we asked, on the one on the left that says A and all of the red lines, that was a response to the question of what species are you concerned about today and kind of in the near future in the next 5 years. And thicker red lines are connections between, these are the locations where the managers were reporting back, and other people who are dealing with those same sets of species. So this is essentially meant to represent, there are a lot of connections going on across the Eastern Seaboard, and including from New York to the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota areas, that we can learn a lot about what's going on in those places. The one on the right is an example specifically, back to the previous slide, or wherever we want. Hold on for the one more back. There it is. Okay, so the image on the right here is specifically for Japanese stiltgrass, and the red dots are managers who reported being concerned about stiltgrass as an emerging threat. The blue dots are all the people who are currently managing stiltgrass. So again, just another example that there are a bunch of people to our south who can give us a lot of information about the species that are coming next. All right, next slide. And so for stiltgrass specifically, this is a area of interest for the Northeast Risk Network. One of the things that we do is to have informational webinars, try to bring together practitioners and scientists to learn the best that we can about the management of these species that are coming our way. This one's from a couple of years ago, but it's posted on our website, specifically focused on stiltgrass, and had a couple of a practitioner and a scientist down from Florida who spent a long time working on this species and know a lot about it. Next slide. Next piece on here is consistent and proactive plant regulations. So this is essentially, if we imagine back to that invasion curve from the beginning and saying you are here at that preventative stage, what's the best way that we can prevent things? It's by stopping their introduction in the first place. Next slide. The place where regulations are most effective, I guess I should say the taxon that taxa that regulations are most effective for are invasive plants. And that's because invasive plants are predominantly introduced as ornamentals. This was a study from now 10 years ago that looked at about 1,000 invasive plants in the US to figure out how many of them were intentionally introduced. Turns out at least 60% intentional, About 10% were accidental, 30% we couldn't find any information about those ones. So actually our intentional percentage might actually be quite a bit higher than that because of the unknowns. Half of all of these thousands, so about 500 invasive plants in the US today can be linked back to an ornamental or horticultural introduction. So that seems like the kind of thing where we should be able to say, okay, there's lots of ornamental plants coming in that are invasive. We know that there's 500 invasive plants that came in as ornamentals. Hopefully we figured that out and we're no longer distributing, selling those particular plants, right? That would be a goal for policy. Next slide. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Most invasive plants are still for sale in the US. So this was a slightly different set of invasive plants that were looked at here, about 1285 total plants, and 61% of them are still available for sale in one or more US states. These vendors are not, I should make clear, breaking laws for the most part. They are selling invasive plants in states where those species are not regulated as invasive plants. They may be invasive plants, and we would argue that in many cases they indeed are being sold where they are actively invasive. But this really brings to mind the need for better coordination across state borders and, really doing a better job of securing our own borders. New York especially does a really good job of looking at, doing a lot of weed risk assessment and promoting a lot of those species for regulation. I'm caught up with you now, so stay on the blue one. One thing that we do have a big challenge with, though, especially thinking about climate change, is regulating what's coming next. So if you can focus on New York here, New York, I believe, at least as of a year or two ago, had 69 plants that were regulated as invasive, so prohibited from sale in the state. Only 5 of those 69 species were not present yet in the state. So we're really good, and this is true across the US, so this is definitely not just a New York phenomenon. We're really good at recognizing what's already widespread and invasive and closing the door on further introductions of those. We're not as good at recognizing what our future invasive plant landscape looks like and stopping those before they enter. Next slide. So here's one example of one that I would argue is a good candidate for New York to proactively regulate. This is Nandina domestica, or heavenly bamboo, picture on the left. This is well documented, well known to be invasive all across the Southeast. And this map over here are based on distribution models, so under current and future climate change. So currently, all those hash marked areas and the kind of slightly darker red hash marks are areas where heavenly bamboo is recognized as invasive. The non-hashed areas that are in red, or various shades of red, are areas where this species could expand and become invasive by 2050, so by mid-century. And it's kind of small to see, but you can see lots of triangles on there, and all of those triangles are nurseries that are currently selling heavenly bamboo. So already on Long Island, there's at least one nursery selling bamboo. I should say these nurseries are ones that this is not a comprehensive list of all nurseries. This is more of what the methods for this were to search for the species for sale, and then look through a couple of Google pages to see who is selling it, and we got the coordinates of those locations. So there may well be more nurseries in New York selling heavenly bamboo. Certainly Maryland has some issues coming down the pike for them. And this graph, I should say, is also a really good example. Even though it's more Southeast focused, this is relevant for all states, that we are doing a really good job of continuing to sell invasive species in areas where they're invasive. So not only are we failing to be proactive, but we're actually perpetuating the problem. Slide, please. So in New York, I'm going to take a second to kind of walk through this graph. this is a graph of regulated species in New York. So that's the lighter gray bar on the left. So there are 69, I remember that right, as of a couple of years ago when we did this analysis, there were 69 invasive plants that were regulated, prohibited from sale in the state of New York. And then there are 292 species that where a weed risk assessment had been conducted for those species. So the 292 is the all, and then as you go across those, based on the outcomes of those weed risk assessments, you have low, moderate, high, or very high risk of invasion. And what we're looking at on this graph is how widespread, on average, those different species are within the state of New York. So if you're at 0, that species is currently absent, or 2 years ago absent from New York, was present in 0% of counties in New York is how we calculated that. Widespread at the top, the 100, that means that the species is present in all of New York counties. So we could consider that for the species that are present in all New York counties, that is very reactive regulation of those invasive species. And for the ones that are absent, basically, you know, or in very few counties, that's much more proactive, climate smart regulation. And the piece that I want to draw your attention to is if you look at the high, so, you know, the 5th bar from the left, the one that says high, 103 below it. So there are 103 species that have been identified as high risk, high invasion risk in the state of New York. And nearly the majority of those, so the median is that black bar, are actually absent from the state of New York. So the New York weed risk assessments work at being proactive. They can effectively identify high-risk species, even if they're not yet in New York. What we failed to do so far is to get those high-risk species that are absent from New York into the New York regulatory bar on the left. That's the big action that we need to continue to work on to make New York more climate smart and proactive in its invasive plant regulation. Next slide. Horizon scanning is another big area to think about in terms of combining our policy and management and making it more climate smart. Horizon scanning, I mentioned before, it is really particularly appropriate for New York, especially when we're talking about pests and, insect pests and pathogens that might affect our forests and our crop systems because of that emerging kind of direct connection between temperate East Asian ports and ports in New York because of sea ice melting. Next slide. So even though I think that the bigger risk for New York are insect pests and pathogens, the studies that have been done for this are much more on invasive plants. So these examples are going to be invasive plants, but would be equally relevant for pests and pathogens. One of the pieces of bad news are challenges to us associated with invasive plants and introduced nursery plants are also the predominant vector for leaf munching and sap sucking. I can tell I'm not an entomologist. Insects. They're also one of the major vectors for bringing in plant pathogens. So this is relevant for not only ornamental plants, but also for the insects and pathogens that they bring with them. These plants tend to be warm adapted. So that is because we tend to get ornamental plants from slightly warmer regions. This is an example actually of a plant that's native to the Mediterranean region of Europe, Saponaria. It's one that I actually have in my yard and have been fighting for a while. So Saponaria is native to, southern France and in Spain and parts of the Mediterranean. All of those little green dots, which might be hard to see on the screen, but they go all up into the Scandinavian countries. Those are nurseries that are selling Saponaria. So in much colder climates, this species is being sold from where it's native. That is also very much true for imports of nursery plants. We are seeing way more rapid rise in imports of nursery plants from warmer countries than the US. So a lot of rising imports from Southeast Asia, from across a variety of countries in Africa, some of the, partially, verging into tropical countries in South America. Certainly if it's tropical, it's probably not a direct risk to New York right now, but there are a lot of things in between. And that means that relative to our native plant populations, the nursery plants that are being brought in are probably pre-adapted to climate change. They already kind of like it hot. They have that advantage. Next slide. So there are tools for horizon scanning. So CABI has a horizon scanning tool, which can give you a ginormous list of a whole bunch of different species that you can to start from. Next slide. I know that ginormous lists are not particularly useful, and that what we're always hearing is we need to narrow those lists down. 2,000 species certainly is not going to be very helpful in terms of which ones to keep an eye out for. Let's continue to narrow it down. So there is a method for that. This is a paper published last year, done for the state of Florida, where they gathered some expert panels, started with this horizon scanning tool, and with a series of sort of decision trees, narrowed that down to 100 species that the expert panel actually focused on and reviewed. And from those 100 species, they were actually able to narrow it down to about 6 like really high risk species that should be on the list for Florida to look out for. Now, Florida is very different from New York in that Florida doesn't have neighbors to the south to look to for invasive plants headed their way. So New York does have a little bit of an advantage in that sense of not only not needing to only focus on the unknowns, but also being able to look to our south and identify some known range shifting plants. Next slide. All right, next topic is climate smart restoration. Next slide. Oh, you're there already. Perfect. That one. So the take-home message here is that climate change is happening fast. It is happening super fast. If we look back at the I always find paleoecology super interesting. And if you look back at paleo history to hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, there are no records of any pre-human induced climate change happening anywhere near as fast as what's going on today. The best record in paleo history is, I'm going to get this wrong, I'm going to say like a few million years ago, like something like 5 million years ago, and temperatures warmed by 1 or 2 degrees over the course of something like 20,000 years. And we're going with 1 or 2 degrees over a century. So that's just to give you some perspective of how fast human-induced climate change is happening. That means that species also need to keep up really fast. So here's just this graphic on here is for the state of Massachusetts, and the blue is basically like the geographical location of where Massachusetts was in climate space in the late 20th century, so 1960 to 1999. This graphic is actually from about 10 years ago, so we're probably down into central New Jersey now in terms of what our temperatures are like today. And then depending on what we do today, what kind of policies we put in place in terms of climate mitigation, we could end up down in Maryland, or we could end up even further south into the Carolinas if, in a worst case scenario of climate change. If we get down into the Carolinas, that's 800 miles approximately that an average species would need to move over the course of 100 years. Most species not equipped to move 800 miles in just 100 years. This means that if we're thinking about invasive plant restoration, so restoration that follows invasive plant management is what I mean by that, then we need to be right now experimenting with warm adapted genotypes. We need to be experimenting with warm adapted species. Next slide, please. this is just there was a paper, this is one of the better known papers, I would say, and we're going on, see, 16 years ago is when this paper was published. Says guidance on climate smart forest management. And some of the key pieces of guidance in here, so this is well accepted across the scientific community. It's been around for 16 years, lots of publications on this topic. They say we need to be expanding genetic diversity guidelines in terms of our restoration so that we can assist the gene flow, taking warmer adapted populations and seeds and bringing them further north. We also need to be establishing with what we would call these neo-native species. This case was forest, but this would apply to any type of ecosystem. And that's something that we would call assisted migration, the human facilitated movement of native species to areas that are slightly outside of their native range to keep up with climate change. Next slide. Some good news that there's been a lot more experimentation, I would say, over the last 10 years. This still, most of what we see is very much kind of in the science field and hasn't, I think, made it out into active management as much as the scientists might like. But from the science side, there's some good news here in that this was actually a study from Europe. So these are, if you don't like the names of some of these genera on here, don't worry, they're in Europe. They're native species to Europe. And they were doing some experimentation with common gardens to use either a local seed admixture, so one that was sourced from local plant communities, and one that was non-local, and non-local here specifically was from warmer climates than where they were planting the seeds. And there were a couple of places where the local seed mixture did a little bit better. Those are the tiny blue squares on top of the gallium ones. There were a couple of places where the non-local one did better. You can see a couple of the red triangles on the left side. But for the most part, you don't see blue squares or red triangles. And that's because regardless of where the seed mixtures came from, the seedlings were performing, they had the same plant biomass, basically, outcomes associated with those two. So one of the concerns that we have in restoration is that if we choose a warm adapted seed mix, maybe it's going to bomb because it's too cold where we are. That does not seem to be the case. That does not seem to be something that we should be worried about. Next slide. One thing that I just want to underscore here is that it totally makes sense, especially when we're talking about a room full of people who are dealing with invasive species. Absolutely makes sense to be concerned about any harm that we would create through assisted gene flow or through moving novel species through assisted migration. The piece that we often neglect or sort of fail to balance against is the fact that climate change is already doing harm. That doing nothing means doing harm to those native communities, because many of those species, we're going to see huge turnovers in species communities, because many of those native species are not going to be able to persist in place with the under warming, under drought, under extreme climate conditions. And so if we say, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to leave that community alone, we are already doing harm, we're already causing disturbance by not sort of seeding species that could potentially persist under those different scenarios. And I should say, I'll just add an anecdote, which is I was just reading a really nice perspective paper on restoration, saying that another area that we can focus on in terms of restoration is thinking about longer time periods during which we are seeding or planting seedlings, because there's a lot of unknowns associated with climate extremes. If we planted something last summer and if we planted all of the seeds that we had last summer when there was an extreme drought, the likelihood is the outcomes would have been very marginal in terms of seedling success. But if we, plant a third of the seeds in that year and then say, uh-oh, we lost them because of drought, but we still have, 2 years or 3 years or something like that remaining of seeds that we've collected. So we're going to kind of roll forward and hope that over the course of multiple years, one of those will be good for seedling success. Next slide. In addition to that point about thinking about restoration over longer time scales than single years, another piece that we need to be thinking about today, yesterday, is building seed supplies. There is a lot of concern in the restoration community that we don't have seed collection, that we're lacking seed banking, that we're lacking the sort of production side to support the large-scale restoration projects that we're going to need moving forward. Some good news is that there's a great new network called the Ecological Health Network, which is very much focused on building more bridges and connections across states, NGOs, and producers, so seed producers, to try to make these linkages that are shown in that circle there, to strengthen a lot of those linkages so that we do have those. But to the extent that that you've got opportunities to collect seeds, go for it. Really important. Next slide. All right, and I think this is my last point here, which is people as part of the solution. That we, and you guys especially in talking to general public, very much have an opportunity to convince people to stop to stop the status quo and move forward with ecological landscaping. So this pie chart of ecological landscaping as a social norm, this pie chart is the status quo. This is not ecological landscaping. So this is from a paper from a number of years ago that was looking at nursery trade. This was actually a study in Kentucky, looking at a bunch of what was sold by nurseries in Kentucky. And all of the different ones in the sort of upper right quadrants are from different parts of the world, but essentially those are all introduced plants sold in Kentucky nurseries, and only 31% of the plants sold in Kentucky nurseries were native to eastern temperate forests. Nursery trade, when you talk to folks in the nursery plant trade, they're going to be the first to tell you that they're just responding to demand. And so we, as we're talking to the public, can try to continue to focus on what does that demand look like. And there's a way to make that more climate smart as well. So next slide. Pristine green lawns are an ecological wasteland. This is well known when people, certainly you could go out there and look around, and you'll probably not see any pollinators. You'll probably not see, depending on how many chemicals this person puts on their lawn, you may not see much in the way of diversity of grasses, very few forbs probably, and certainly very few pollinators. And as you sort of scale that up, right, if we look at like Doug Tallamy's work, for example, if you don't have not only thinking about insect pollinators, but also thinking about caterpillars and the bottom of the food chain that is basically food for baby birds, food for various other higher trophic levels that we might want as part of an ecosystem. So having a grassy lawn, is more of a social norm as opposed to, why does this thing even exist as an American standard? It shouldn't. Next slide is even better is to promote native plant landscaping. So this is an example of a native East Coast meadow. If we promote native landscaping, we achieve two big things for ecosystems. One is supporting those pollinators, and the caterpillars and the things that scale up to support ecosystems, and the plants too. The other is that it really reduces the likelihood that we're going to introduce, not intentionally, but introduce more invasive species. Because if you're focused on native plant planting, there are precious few native plants that we would consider really problematic or weedy in the same way that we would consider introduced plants to be problematic or weedy. And that's a whole other lecture as to why that is. So you have to trust me. Next slide. And then even better, if we're merging invasive species and climate change, is thinking not only about planting native, but actually planting climate smart native. This is a pamphlet on the right that we put together a few years ago, and we're actually working on an update with a bigger list of climate smart native plants across the Northeast. Home gardeners are, if the status quo basically is planting an introduced or invasive species, then why not encourage gardeners to plant warm adapted natives, right? That way, if something goes wrong, it can't be any worse than than planting more bittersweet or something like that or the next generation of bittersweet in our yards. So stay tuned for more resources also on that particular topic. But this pamphlet is a nice one for home gardeners because it's sort of a general introduction to these topics of being climate smart, minimizing risk from invasive species, and promoting ecological landscapes. And it has a fold out of a bunch of different species that people could consider. Once you get hooked on plants, there's no going back. Next slide. So in terms of our policy and management, a lot of ecologically friendly policies, mean enabling institutions to lead by example with these climate smart landscaping. So to the extent that you have any control or insight or power over, what gets planted where you work, thinking about native plant planting, thinking about what's further south, and incentivizing that ecological landscaping becomes really important because, a lot of what we do in terms of leading by example means that homeowners and urban gardeners are exposed to species that we wouldn't normally see in our average sort of big box store. Many states and the federal government have subsidies for things like solar panels. So why not subsidies for ecological landscaping, which does, has similar climate adaptation benefits. Next slide, last slide, actually. So thanks so much for listening to me. This is our website is risknetwork.org. So just about everything that I've talked about today is someplace on Risk Network. Risk is a boundary spanning organization. So like I said at the beginning, if you're interested in this stuff and want to talk to a bunch of mostly scientists about how they can make their science better and more applicable to management, we very much would love to have you join. Or if you're voyaging outside of New York, we can also help you build your own bridging organization, stuff like that. And I guess I have one more slide, which is just the little digest list of all of the ways of becoming climate smart. So you've got those as options. And I will stop there. I will say it's quite hard for me to hear the microphone, but I can hear from right next to the phone video pretty well. And I've got time to stay for questions if you guys have time in your schedule.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. Great presentation. One of the most important topics of our community. So thank you for that. And we probably do have some questions.
If you have a question, if you could stand closer to the phone so if you could hear it, that would be appreciated.
Come up or Abby can ask it for you. However it works.
Hi, this is Steve Young. You got through the whole talk without mentioning deer. So, on this climate change and planting natives and assisted migration, the deer eating everything, all the native plants here. So unless you talk about that, it seems like it's fruitless to do that. Also, I was just wondering about how the deer are clearing out the understory and how that's affecting the climate of the understory, the heating up of that area because there's no plants there. And maybe invasives are actually ameliorating that. So, and one more question is that the DEC seems to be having a problem with this new regulated list. I'm just wondering if you had talked with them about them because the plants were looked at a long time ago, and these new lists were made, but they haven't been able to pass it.
I'm gonna let your deer comments stay as comments because I have nothing else to add to that. I totally agree. That's a whole separate issue that where I sit on the eastern edge of the Connecticut River is actually we have plenty of deer, but like nothing like you guys have in New York. So it's actually not one that like rises to the top of my mind is, but recognize that that is a huge issue in New York. And I don't know the answer to any of those points. We have a working group of invasive plant council representatives, and I have missed the last couple of meetings of those. So I haven't heard from DEC about what their latest is as far as getting some of those recommendations into regulation. But I can ask some colleagues about putting that on our agenda for the next meeting, which I think is happening in October.
Thank you. Any other questions? Nina has a question just coming up. Step right up.
Thank you. Hi, Bethany. This is Mina with Cooperative Extension. I had a question. It's a policy question. In some of your surveys that you've done with learning, what states have various invasive species policies, have you also asked the question if there was a certain entity or agency that was actually tasked with enforcement?
No. We have mostly, sorry, I'm just trying to think about the states that do have that though. So I think Wisconsin would probably be a good one to talk to because they do specifically have regulation that not only requires, I'm ignorant about this as far as New York goes. Massachusetts and other New England states have policies about reporting new infestations of species, so for early detection and rapid response, but they actually have no policy that requires that they do anything about those early detections and rapid response, about those early detections of novel species, and that feels like a huge barrier for those states. I'm not sure how that works in New York, but I know that Wisconsin has specific policy that that enables the treatment of new infestations of species. Not sure I don't think I actually answered your question. I answered a slightly different question.
That's okay. That was interesting to hear that. I guess my specific question is, I'll provide the example here in New York State where, you reference the regulation that affects like the prohibited and regulated invasive plants and other species here in New York State, but then Suffolk County and Nassau County also has its own regulation regarding the sale and movement of whatnot of invasive plants, but there's no entity, no agency that has been tasked with enforcement, that compared to New York State, which does have an entity that's tasked with enforcement, New York State Ag and Markets, but the laws are not similar. So, the regulated plants in New York State are banned in Suffolk County. So I was just wondering if there were similarities in other states that you've interacted with where they have this law on the books, but there's no enforcement. So it's basically, like a moot law, like it's just a law with no enforcement.
Wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that different New York counties had different invasive plant regulations. I haven't come across that in other states and that's new to me in New York. There are definitely lots of states that have regulations and have very, effectively non-existent enforcement. I mean, Massachusetts is an example of that. We've talked to some of the nurseries locally, near where I am, and they say basically, yeah, somebody shows up like twice a year, and we often know when they're coming. So if we wanted to work around, so if people were like indeed bad actors and wanted to work around it, they could. That said, when we did that analysis of invasive plants that are still for sale, we actually didn't find, it was much more likely for a plant to be sold in a state that was like neighboring a state that had that species regulated, which we interpreted as, that nursery isn't doing anything wrong. The nursery is just responding to that state's failed regulations, basically. That was very common. It was much less common to find examples of nurseries selling species that were regulated within that state. So even though we lack enforcement. Having the regulations in place, having a list out there seems to work. You know, that I don't think that the nurseries are out there aiming to introduce invasive species. So I think if we're clear about this list is invasive, they are responding to that, even if people aren't going to check on a regular basis.
Thank you.
Any
Are
other
we-
questions? I think that's it.
I think that's it. I haven't been able to see the chat.
I see one question in the chat and I will answer it in the chat.
Okay, that sounds great. And we'll, yeah,
Other-
Yep. Bethany Bradley.
Yes, I'm easy to Google. So if any of this is interesting to you or you want slides or anything like that, feel free to email me. I should be easy to find on the internet. Thanks
Great.
so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.